Heaven, thought Kate hurriedly, how comes she in such society? Now Kate thought thus so hurriedly, and the surprise was so great, and moreover brought back so forcibly the recollection of what had passed at Ralph's delectable dinner, that she turned extremely pale, and appeared greatly agitated; which symptoms being observed by Mrs. Nickleby, were at once set down by that acute lady as being caused and occasioned by violent love. But, although she was in no small degree delighted by this discovery, which reflected so much credit on her own quickness of perception, it did not lessen her motherly anxiety in Kate's behalf, and accordingly, with a vast quantity of trepidation, she quitted her own box to hasten into that of Miss Wititterly. Miss Wititterly, keenly alive to the glory of having a lord and baronet among her visiting acquaintances, lost no time in signalling to Mr. Wititterly to open the door. And thus it was that in less than 30 seconds Mrs. Nickleby's party had made an irruption into Mrs. Wititterly's box, which it filled to the very door, there being in fact only room for Messrs. Pyke and Pluck to get in their heads and waistcoats. "My dear Kate," said Mrs. Nickleby, kissing her daughter affectionately, "how ill you looked a moment ago! You quite frightened me, I declare." "It was mere fancy, mama. The reflection of the lights, perhaps," replied Kate, glancing nervously around, and finding it impossible to whisper any caution or explanation. "Don't you see Sir Mulberry Hawk, my dear?" Kate bowed slightly, and biting her lip turned her head towards the stage. But Sir Mulberry Hawk was not to be so easily repulsed, for he advanced with extended hand, and Mrs. Nickleby officiously informing Kate of this circumstance, she was obliged to extend her own. Sir Mulberry detained it while he murmured a profusion of compliments, which Kate, remembering what had passed between them, rightly considered as so many aggravations of the insult he had already put upon her. Then followed the recognition of Lord Verisopht, and then the greeting of Mr. Pyke, and then that of Mr. Pluck, and finally, to complete the young lady's mortification, she was compelled at Miss Wititterly's request to perform the ceremony of introducing the odious persons, whom she regarded with the utmost indignation and abhorrence. "Mrs. Wititterly is delighted," said Mr. Wititterly, rubbing his hands, "delighted, my lord, I am sure, with this opportunity of contracting an acquaintance which, I trust, my lord, we shall improve. Julia, my dear, you must not allow yourself to be much too excited. You must not. Indeed you must not. Mrs. Wititterly is of a most excitable nature, Sir Mulberry. The snuff of a candle, the wick of a lamp, the bloom on a peach, the down on a butterfly, you might blow her away, my lord. You might blow her away." Sir Mulberry seemed to think that it would be a great convenience if the lady could be blown away. He said, however, that the delight was mutual, and Lord Verisopht added that it was mutual, whereupon Messrs. Pyke and Pluck were heard to murmur from a distance that it was very mutual indeed. "I take an interest, my lord," said Miss Wititterly, with a faint smile, "such an interest in the drama." "Yes, it's very interesting," replied Lord Verisopht. "I'm always ill after Shakespeare," said Miss Wititterly. "I scarce exist the next day. I find the reaction so very great after a tragedy, my lord, and Shakespeare is such a delicious creature." "Yes," replied Lord Verisopht, "he was a clever man." "You know, my lord," said Miss Wititterly, after a long silence, "I find I take so much more interest in his plays, after having been to that dear dull house where he was born in. Were you ever there, my lord?" "No, never," replied Lord Verisopht. "Then really you ought to go, my lord," returned Miss Wititterly in very languid and drawling accents. "I don't know how it is, but after you've seen the place and written your name in the little book, somehow or other you seem to be inspired. It kindles up quite a fire within one." "Yes," replied Lord Verisopht, "I shall certainly go there." "Julia, my life," interposed Mr. Wititterly, "you are deceiving his lordship. Unintentionally, my lord, she is deceiving you. It is your poetical temperament, my dear, your ethereal soul, your fervid imagination, which throws you into a glow of genius and excitement. There is nothing in the place, my dear. Nothing, nothing." "I think there must be something in the place," said Mrs. Nickleby, who had been listening in silence, "for soon after I was married, I went to Stratford with my poor dear Mr. Nickleby, in a post chaise from Birmingham. Was it a post chaise, though?" said Mrs. Nickleby, considering. "Yes, it must have been a post chaise, because I recollect remarking at the time that the driver had a green shade over his left eye. In a post chaise from Birmingham. and after we had seen Shakespeare's tomb and birthplace, we went back to the inn there, where we slept that night. And I recollect that all night long I dreamt of nothing but a black gentleman, at full length, in plaster of Paris, with a lay-down collar tied with 2 tassels, leaning against a post and thinking. And when I awoke the next morning and described him to Mr. Nickleby, he said it was Shakespeare, just as he had been when he was alive, which was very curious indeed. Stratford, continued Mrs. Nickleby, considering. Yes, I am positive about that, because I recollect I was in the family way with my son Nicholas at the time, and I had been very much frightened by an Italian image boy that very morning. In fact, it was quite a mercy, ma'am, added Mrs. Nickleby, in a whisper to Mrs. Wititterly, that my son didn't turn out to be a Shakespeare, and what a dreadful thing that would have been. When Mrs. Nickleby had brought this interesting anecdote to a close, Pyke and Pluck, ever zealous in their patron's cause, proposed the adjournment of the detachment of the party into the next box, and so with much skill were the preliminaries adjusted, that Kate, despite all she could say or do to the contrary, had no alternative but to suffer herself to be led away by Sir Mulberry Hawk. Her mother and Mr. Pluck accompanied them, but the worthy lady, pluming herself upon her discretion, took particular care to not so much as look at her daughter during the whole evening, and to seem wholly absorbed in the jokes and conversation of Mr. Pluck, who, having been appointed sentry over Mrs. Nickleby for that especial purpose, neglected on his side no possible opportunity of engrossing her attention. Lord Frederick Verisopht remained in the next box to be talked to by Mrs. Wititterly, and Mr. Pyke was in attendance to throw in a word or two when necessary. As to Mr. Wititterly, he was sufficiently busy in the body of the house, informing such of his friends and acquaintances as happened to be there, that those 2 gentlemen upstairs, whom they had seen in conversation with Mrs. W., were the distinguished Lord Frederick Verisopht and his most intimate friend, the gay Sir Mulberry Hawk, a communication which inflamed several respectable housekeepers with the utmost jealousy and rage, and reduced 16 unmarried daughters to the very brink of despair. The evening came to an end at last, but Kate had yet to be handed downstairs by the detested Sir Mulberry, and so skilfully were the manoeuvres of Messrs. Pyke and Pluck conducted, that she and the baronet were the last of the party, and were even, without the appearance of effort or design, left at some little distance behind. Don't hurry, said Sir Mulberry as Kate hastened on, and attempted to release her arm. She made no reply, but still pressed forward. Nay, then, coolly observed Sir Mulberry, stopping her outright. You had best not seek to detain me, sir, said Kate angrily. And why not? retorted Sir Mulberry. My dear creature, now why do you keep up this show of displeasure? Show! repeated Kate indignantly. How dare you presume to speak to me, sir, to address me, to come into my presence? You look prettier in a passion, Miss Nickleby, said Sir Mulberry Hawk, stooping down, the better to see her face. I hold you in the bitterest detestation and contempt, sir, said Kate. If you find any attraction in looks of disgust and aversion, let me rejoin my friend, sir, instantly. Whatever considerations may have withheld me thus far, I will disregard them all, and take a course that even you might feel, if you do not immediately suffer me to proceed. Sir Mulberry smiled, and looking down in her face and retaining her arm, walked towards the door. If no regard for my sex or helpless situation will induce you to desist from this coarse and unmanly persecution, said Kate, scarcely knowing, in the tumult of her passions, what she said, I have a brother who will resent it dearly one day. "'Pon my soul!" exclaimed Sir Mulberry, as though quietly communing with himself, passing his arms round her waist as he spoke. "She looks more beautiful, and I like her better in this mood, than when her eyes are cast down, and she is in perfect repose." How Kate reached the lobby where her friends were waiting she never knew, but she hurried across it without at all regarding them, and disengaged herself suddenly from her companion, sprang into the coach, and throwing herself into its darkest corner burst into tears. Messrs. Pyke and Pluck, knowing their cue, at once threw the party into great commotion by shouting for the carriages, and getting up a violent quarrel with sundry inoffensive bystanders, in the midst of which tumult they put the affrighted Mrs. Nickleby in her chariot, and having got her safely off, turned their thoughts to Mrs. Wititterly, whose attention also they had now effectually distracted from the young lady, by throwing her into a state of the utmost bewilderment and consternation. At length the conveyance in which she had come rolled off too with its load, and the 4 worthies, being left alone under the portico, enjoyed a hearty laugh together. 'There!' said Sir